Hey, how's it going, guys? So we're back with another Star Citizen video. If you're new channel, welcome. So I watched 4 videos by the Astro Historian. So shout out and credit goes to the Astro Historian for this video. And some of you guys did specify that some topics were not really gone in depth, or there's a lot of details left out. So you guys told me to also check out those kind of those topics. And one of them was the first interplanetary war. And I managed to find it with the Astro Historian, and this one's called First Bloody Interplanetary War, Unification Wars, Star Citizen Lore. And I'm really curious as to see how this is going to go, but of course it's war, so there's going to be a lot of, death counts and just like who fought who and things like that. But without anything else, let's just jump right into the video.
Change is one of the constants of human history. As time marches forward, so does the rise and fall of societies, cultures, and mighty empires. Nothing withstands the march of time. It is also inevitable that there will be those who resist change, more often than not, violently, no matter if their cause is righteous or not. This is often the catalyst for wars, both large and small, which shape the foundation of human history in their wake. One such event, which shaped the history of mankind, was a series of relatively small battles, which would change the fate of humanity forever. What has become known as the Unification Wars. My name is Paul Shelley, and welcome to the Astro Historian. This is a channel dedicated to exploring and explaining the lore of sci-fi and space universes and discussing their impact. Today we'll be talking about the universe of Star Citizen, specifically one of the foundational events of human history, the Unification Wars. To start, while the term Unification Wars may seem grandiose for what seems like limited engagements compared to modern space battles and invasions of the 30th century, it's important to note that this was the first interplanetary conflict, including the first space battles in human history. Space travel was still relatively primitive, and even supply lines between Earth and Mars were iffy at best before the start of these conflicts. So while generally historians have divided these conflicts into 3 separate wars, that is mostly a means to categorize what was effectively 3 separate stages and major battles of a single multi-year conflict.
Okay.
Before we get into that, we need to understand the lead-up to the Unification Wars. In 2281, many nations of Earth met to form what was known as the World Summit. This was a group of nations who were all attempting to terraform and settle the newly discovered Croshaw system. Though the initial attempts to terraform Mars had
cool city design.
The efforts of many nations and companies, the process was well known by the late 23rd century, and thus many different governments were racing to lay claim to the new worlds. This was leading to heightened tensions between the various governments of Earth and the threat of war. At the World Summit, these nations agreed to a limited constitution, and thus a proto-Earth government was formed, though only focusing on colonial expansion. The first act of the World Summit was to form the Croshaw Expansion Committee, who were responsible for the expansion into the system. This committee may have also created what would become known as the Freeman Act. This was a law that guaranteed the right to settle the Croshaw system and gave a one-way ticket for a modest fee, which would be used to fund the terraformation and development of Croshaw itself. This cooperation between the various nations and corporations of Earth proved very successful. However, new jump points were being discovered rapidly, and the scope of the World Summit was mostly focused on Croshaw. So as tensions were beginning to rise once more between more and more nations, likely those not already part of the World Summit, it was becoming clear that a more permanent solution was needed for future exploration, colonization, and exploitation of space. In April of 2380, the World Summit met at the United Nations, with the rest of the nations of Earth in attendance. For 2 weeks, the nations debated and discussed what the best way forward was. Finally, on April
2 weeks.
2380, Ivan Sang approached a podium before a crowd of breathless reporters, flanked by representatives of all the major superpowers of humanity, and gave a now famous speech.
It is an exciting time in human history.
We actually get to listen to it.
Threshold of a new era. where deep space exploration and colonization are not simply a possibility, they are a certainty. Advances in terraforming technology and astro design are letting us travel further and further out into the cosmos. The goal of this summit was to ask a question. It was not where do we go from here? It was how do we go from here? Expansion on this level cannot succeed with competing national, political, and even commercial interests. Our personal squabbles seem insignificant with the breadth of space open before us. We have debated and discussed, but concluded that if we are to set out into space, we must do so as a single, unified race. Therefore, we are announcing the intention to form a single governing body for this and all planets. The United Nations of Earth.
The UNE.
Each of the government leaders before you will return with a referendum to their respective countries. There is a lot of work ahead, many issues to address and resolve. We have a long road to building a stable working government of this magnitude. Know this, we will get there. We will be fair. We will be united. Thank you, and good night.
The first unified human government
Nice.
was born, not out of war, but of a more common conflict, facing a much more monstrous and challenging foe, the vastness of space itself. It's important to remember that only a few generations back, humanity had nearly wiped itself out during the overpopulation era. The only times humanity advanced in their conquest and settlement of space was when the nations of Earth set aside their differences and worked together. So it is very likely that the superpowers of Earth had already come to the grips with the idea that the only way forward was a unified government. This new UNE.
That's pretty big, because I mean, there's always several parties that will literally disagree with one another and never come together with a single goal or unify. I mean, it's rare, but however, there's always going to be conflicting interests and conflicting point of views. But the fact that everyone managed to unify, that is big. And now let's see what they accomplished. But I mean, we already see what they accomplished. We saw the game Star Citizen and everything, but still, you know what I mean.
Also seemed to be direct replacement for the aging United Nations, likely taking over the UN building temporarily in New York, as that city would go on to become the capital of the new government. By July 12, 2380, the first Council of Nations meeting would take place. This marked that day as Unification Day, which is still celebrated today in the UEE as Imperator's Day. The UNE would adopt a new flag and icon, that of the 3 rings and 6 stars. The interlocking rings represented the 3 settled entities of humanity: Earth, Mars, and the Croshaw system. The 6 stars represented the future ambition of traveling into space, but they may have also stood for the claimed but not yet fully terraformed systems of Redder, Caliban, Centauri, Fora, Nemo, and Banshee. The Council began working to try and get the rest of the nations of humanity to rally under its banner. But the harsh dissolution of member nations into weaker states was not popular with everyone in these former countries. It seemed that many saw this as an illegal and dictatorial attempt at undermining the unique societies of humanity. However, there didn't seem to be many who were outwardly hostile to the idea, keeping their objections to themselves or only expressing them in their local states. Despite this, the UNE moved fairly quickly to begin to unify the former nations' militaries under a single command. This was a move that would prove disastrous for the fledgling government. One of the ships moved under the new UEE Navy was the Americanio battlecruiser known as the Stanley. More than a third of the crew, including the captain, resigned prior to the transfer after refusing to swear allegiance to the UNE, and instead reconfirming their fealty to their home nation. The Navy replaced the vacant positions with new recruits, who were drawn from all the member nations as an attempt to show multilateral and multicultural makeup of the new Navy.
Damn,
These
a
changes
third?
angered the remaining Americano crew, leading to many clashes and multiple disciplinary reports being filed for fighting and insubordination.
Okay, so this is where it starts escalating. But I'm just saying a third of the crew and including the captain resigned because of that. And I think I kind of spoiled a little bit because now it says the mutiny on the Stanley. Got it.
Rumors began to swirl that the remaining Americano crew were going to be separated and reassigned to different ships. As a result, a contingent of these crew members decided to take matters into their own hands to prevent this. On October 20th, 2380, this group armed themselves and mutinied, taking control of the ship. The initial goal of these mutineers was to use the Stanley to, quote, liberate our country from the tyranny of the UNE, end quote. They planned on achieving this by bombing a number of Earth's major cities from orbit if their demands for Americano sovereignty weren't met. The UNE Navy put together a plan to stop the mutineers from reaching Earth, and in a risky but highly successful assault, they were able to disable and retake the ship without a single death on either side. In the spirit of reconciliation, the UNE gave lenient sentences to most of the mutineers, but the three ringleaders received harsh sentences to send the message to other anti-unification sympathizers.
Makes sense.
On November 8th, 2380, in response to the Stanley Mutiny and in celebration of opening a new government building that would become the future Senate, military delegates from each formerly independent nation marched from different locations in New York City, converging at the newly built building. Laurel wreaths were then distributed to all soldiers who made an oath to protect all of humanity on the steps of the building. This symbolic event would become known as Pax Humana, an event which is still held today. However,
Pax Humana.
despite the Unificationists seemingly showing their power, the Stanley had set in place what would become the first interplanetary conflict of human history. On December 9th, 2380, two UNE warships, the Pongwani and Cassano, vanished during a routine patrol. The Navy quickly dispatched ships to determine their fate, only for the search party to be ambushed. The captains and crews of the Pongwani and Cassano had secretly orchestrated a defection, and after repelling the search party, broadcast a message calling for all other UNE vessels to, quote, join them in rejecting the hegemonic authority of the UNE. Over the following week, 4 more warships would defect and join a loose alliance whose main demand centered on the dissolution of the UNE.
Wow.
The first unification.
4 more ships. So now they got a small fleet going. But yeah, I mean, I thought it was going way too well when they said earlier when they said everyone like joined up and unified under one government. But then as soon as we started talking about mutiny and how it came down to rejecting point of views and things like that, it all made sense where things went wrong.
War had begun. However, the group never fully unified, as each ship continued to operate under its own command and make additional demands specific to its crew's nations of origin, even sometimes in direct opposition of one another. Still, this was a threat to the newly emerged unified government, and the UNE Navy knew they had to take desperate actions if they were to ensure their new opposition would not continue to grow. To this end, the Navy took drastic measures in reassigning all of its remaining crews of every single UNE naval vessel to ensure people from the same former country were separated. While seen today as a successful move
to make sure
prevent
no
more
mutinies.
defections, it did also slow the Navy's response to the new rebel forces. Meanwhile, the anti-unification warships baited the Navy into skirmishes by advancing towards cities on Earth and Mars or the jump to Croshaw. The Navy briefly engaged the ships but avoided an all-out battle. While they claimed to be prioritizing the protection of civilians and cities, the UNE naval brass also worried that destroying the warships would create martyrs for the anti-unification movement, and wanted the warships returned to the UNE fleet undamaged, as their budget wasn't exactly large, and the UNE was seemingly very resistant to expanding the fleets. The Navy's focus on disabling and recapturing the warships frustrated many and allowed the rebellious ships to escape on several occasions. When one skirmish resulted in major damage to a Navy warship and the loss of 5 crew members, the Navy adjusted its tactics to go on the offensive and began picking off the anti-unificationists' ships rather than waiting for them to threaten territories. 4 were disabled and captured, and 2 were destroyed. The Panjwani held out the longest and was finally destroyed on March 22, 2381.
Here comes the
thus
death
bringing
toll.
the First Unification War to a close. However, the 6 rebel ships had managed to galvanize many who were in the anti-unification camp, and their memory would go on to spark yet another war. Tensions remained high through the middle of 2381.
One war
with a
after
growing
another.
contingent of anti-unificationists publicly expressing their desire to dissolve the UNE. Intelligence services of the UNE monitored their chatter and noted that a common belief was that the defecting warships failed in their objectives because they lacked a landing zone to repair and resupply. So, in June of 2381, an intelligence report noted that the frontier settlement of Syrtis on Mars, home to a large contingent of expats from Sumercadia who had opposed the dissolution of their country, had opened their city to anti-unificationist allies. As a result, Syrtis' population had dramatically increased, and the settlement began expanding and strengthening its fortifications. When illegally obtained military-grade anti-aircraft turrets were installed in early August, the UNE sent the military to retrieve the weapons, only to be met with force. The Second Unification War had begun. The unexpected level of resistance surprised the military, who decided against escalating the incident and endangering Syrtis' civilians. Instead, the military pulled its forces back, encircled Syrtis, and waited. Besides keeping anyone from entering or leaving Syrtis, the UNE military instituted a no-fly zone and blocked transmissions to stymie communications. Early UNE assessments believed that the settlement had strategic food and water reserves to last 6 months. Yet, nearly a year later, the residents of Syrtis remained defiant and refused to surrender.
So they had food and water to last 6 months, and they managed to last to at least a year, and they're still going strong. Wow, they really rationed out, and their resolve is strong. But yeah, after one unification war, here comes the second one. But as stated, the first one, this is basically one long war, just 3 different sections. But let's hear how they made it out, because if they can turn 6 months of food and water into lasting 1 year and still staying strong, whew, that's a strong enemy.
Communications being cut off, civilian observers monitored the settlement and the UNE's actions and relayed daily updates to the standoff to anti-unification circles. The incident became known as the Siege of Syrtis and grew into a rallying cry and recruitment tool for the anti-unificationist movement, which by now had solidified into a single united group representing people from all the former nations of Earth, known as the Anti-Unification Alliance, or AUA. Some members of the UN Council believed the standoff made the government look weak and unable to enforce the laws Syrtis was subject to, so they ramped up pressure on the military to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. When residents inside Syrtis refused to negotiate with the UNE, claiming the government had no authority over the settlement, several psychologically stressful tactics were deployed, including blasting of loud music, night-to-day aerial bombardment to create a canopy of noise, and light at night to try to exhaust the inhabitants for days on end. None of these ploys convinced the residents of Syrtis
Man, look at those guns.
and only generated more support for the AUA and ire for the UNE government from the wider civilian population. The UNE Council became convinced that the optics of the standoff were helping the anti-unificationists more than anything, and ordered the military to end it. On July 4th, 2383, the military assaulted the settlement in the dead of night, and, after a brief and very bloody battle, took control of Syrtis. While it's never explicitly stated, it is implied that many of the fallen of Syrtis were civilians. The Second Unification War had ended, with the bloody toll for both sides.
Wow.
The image of the UNE military as butchers drove even more people to join the AUA cause, though for the moment, the UNE had managed to prevent more hostilities. The bloody end to the situation in Syrtis drew widespread criticism and strengthened support for the Anti-Unification Alliance, which also evolved its tactics and communication methods. peaceful and persuasive AUA members became the face of the movement. They held rallies, wrote op-eds, and made constant media appearances to promote their position that the UNE was an imperialist and unelected power structure with no real authority over everyday people. Meanwhile, UNE analysts noticed a troubling silence coming from the more militant wing of the anti-unification movement, and worried something was in the works. They were right. With the measures taken by the UNE Navy to purge and disempower anti-unificationists within its ranks, the AUA focused on building a fleet of personal ships and modifying them with weapon systems, which were uncommon and extremely hard to acquire by civilians during this time period. The movement also made inroads and gathered strong support within the burgeoning militia community. You see,
Yeah, so the UNE may have ended the Second Unification War, but at what cost? Killing that many civilians on top of that? Everyone sees the images, so I don't really consider that a victory. I consider that a huge defeat, even though they're the ones standing and alive instead of the civilians. All right, Third Unification War.
Following unification, many warships deemed too outdated for the UNE Navy were retained by local governments. These were then deployed to patrol shipping lanes, aid in humanitarian missions, and handle low-level encounters with the budding criminal elements of the system. In early 2384, commanders of the makeshift AUA fleet began secretly meeting and plotting with the captains of some of these aging warships. On July 29, 2384, the UNE Navy received word that a militia warship that had vanished the previous week was approaching New York City. While local air controllers were attempting to contact the ship, it fired upon the Navy ships sent to intercept it, and then fled. When the Navy mobilized ships in the region to pursue the rogue warship, the rest of the AUA fleet attacked New York City, heading for the same target,
New York
the
City.
United Nations of Earth Plaza, which housed the main legislative and administrative functions for the new unified government.
That would be a pretty
The
big
mission
blow.
was simple: destroy the seat of UNE power and then use the ensuing chaos to convince countries and regions to abandon the unified government. Upon realizing the true scope of the attack, the Navy recalled most of its ships to come to the defense of New York City. This was the beginning of the third and final Unification War. For hours, the skies above New York City became ablaze in battle. Residents sought refuge in basements and subway tunnels as debris and damaged ships crashed into the city. The Navy rightfully assumed the intended target was the UNE Plaza and put everything into its defense. When it became clear the anti-unificationists wouldn't be able to overcome the Navy's defensive line, they adjusted their tactics to spread maximum fear and chaos by attacking the urban sprawl around the main city. Some of their warships fired randomly upon buildings, while others intentionally crashed into the city instead of surrendering. With
Wow,
the number
kamikaze.
of AUA ships dwindling, several of the rebellious ships fled instead of surrendering. These ships hid in the outer reaches of the Sol system or slipped into Croshaw. Knowing no UNE port would ever give them safe harbor, the crews of these ships would go on to form several well-known outlaw gangs. And despite UNE efforts to bring them to justice, many became infamous for raiding trading lanes through Sol and Croshaw. This likely includes the now infamous Nova Riders, the first pirates to ambush ships mid-flight. The fight for New York City finally brought the mainstream anti-unification movement and the Unification Wars to an end. The random and mass destruction wrought upon New York City and its surrounding area angered UNE residents and turned the general public against the movement for good. While there would be some small skirmishes with anti-unificationists in the following decades, historians officially consider the fight for New York City as the final battle of the Unification Wars. The destruction of skirmishes with anti-unificationists in the following decades.
So I seen these images. So that's what this was. The Battle of New York. And all its ruin and everything. I forgot where I saw it. I think it was a ship commercial, or a UEE like recruitment video or something. Man, I don't remember.
Decades wars. The destruction of New York City was extensive, yet many famous and culturally significant locations thankfully survived. Today, many historians credit the massive rebuilding effort, including RSI's decision to build a huge headquarter complex where the largest warship crashed, as key to the modernization of New York City, leading to the upgrades and improvements that would solidify the city's status as a political and cultural capital with one foot firmly in the past and the other in the future. While the Unification Wars saw humanity face great divisions and terrible internal strife, the result coalesced support behind and solidified the sovereignty of a human unified government that would boldly lead the species into the wider universe. It also established an anti-government sentiment that would become common among outlaws and reverberated through time.
Look at that logo on the shoulder.
The AUA was partially right. Without the UNE and its replacement, the UPE, there wouldn't have been a structure in place to allow the rise of Ivar Messer and the totalitarian fascism of the Messer-era UEE. Even today, with the new UEE's kindler and gentler humanity, groups like the People's Alliance of Levski and countless other anti-government groups still oppose the unified human government, seeing it as illegitimate and untrustworthy. Effectively,
of course,
the Unification Wars helped cement the path history would take, for better or for worse, leading to create the Star Citizen universe as it exists today.
So it's a crucial part of history.
I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, think about hitting that like button, subscribing for more content, and tapping the bell icon to be notified when these release. Additionally, I'd like to thank the guest voice actor for this episode, a longtime Star Citizen content creator and friend of mine, Angry PC Tech, who asked to do one of these in the future, and so I figured this would be a good one for him. Check him out in the link down in the description. I'd also like to thank those on the screen now for supporting the channel financially. If you want to throw in a few credits, think about becoming a member on YouTube. And if you want a bit more for your contribution, join the Ko-fi or Patreon. Ko-fi members and Patreons get early, ad-free access to all videos, including exclusive early access to my long-running Complete History of Star Citizen lore series. Check those out now in the top right if you want to know what you're getting. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on the Unification Wars and any other lore topics in the comments below. And as always, remember, ex historia ad astra.
So that was really interesting, going into the Interplanetary War and basically breaking it down into like 3 different wars: the first Unification War, second one, the third one, all that. So it all started because of a unification reason, and many people opposed the unification, and that led to something small as a mutiny on a ship to a massive space battle or air battle, whatever you like to call it, above New York City, which caused so much damage to the city. But either way, this is really interesting, and yeah, it was pretty bloody, especially the end of the second Unification War. The Cyprus. I'm sorry, I'm not good with the names of locations. You know, the siege location where basically the UNE just like UNE just eliminated more civilians than soldiers. So that is a huge reason why it escalated and why the enemy became stronger. So that's probably why it was more difficult to defeat the anti-unification alliance in the third Unification War. I mean, Interplanetary War. But this is a really great video and very informative. So shout out and credit goes to the Astro Historian, as usual, for creating great videos. So that's all I got today, guys. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for watching. Hit that notification bell so you know when I drop another video. And also shout out to all my members, subscribers, viewers. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for your support, guys. I really do appreciate it. So without anything else, I'll see you guys next time.